Hi there, I'm David Lang. Thank you all very much for coming to this. I am the artist in residence, and I've been asked to say a few words about the artist in residence program. So the Institute for Advanced Study has for many years now had an artist in residence, and that artist has been a musician, which is an incredible gift to my field, that all these incredibly scholarly, noble, brainy people have all agreed that music should be a part of their life is incredible, and I really appreciate it, and my entire field appreciates it. So I've been trying to curate concerts and salons and activities which take advantage of the fact that people show up to things, as you have, and so it's been wonderful to be able to be part of this great community. And also, very selfishly, I have written a huge amount of music while I have been in residence, which is also a great gift. So this is the very first book chat that we are doing, the very first salon that we are doing this year. And so I just want to say something about the other ones that are coming up and about the series in general. In the past, I've had salons which were musicians coming in to talk about what they did, but I thought that this year maybe I could expand a little to because it's selfish to think that all culture is musical. So I'm trying to branch out to other things. And I have a very broad definition of what is conversation about something that has to do with our culture, right, with a cultural issue. So what I decided to do this year was to invite people who have recent books that touch somehow on some cultural issue. And so we have tonight, Frank Snowden. We'll get into that a little bit later, but the next book chat that we have, I'm going to call them book chats until I can think of something better to call them. I know it's kind of like a boring name, but eventually I'll figure it out. The next person who will be speaking is the music critic Alex Ross. So Alex Ross is the head critic for The New Yorker, and he's probably the most influential music writer in America right now in the classical music world. He has a book called Wagnerism, which just came out 2 weeks ago, which is an amazing book about not just Richard Wagner, but also the idea of Wagner and also the ideas behind what Wagner did and how those ideas got out into the general culture. So it's a really amazing book. After that, we have Emily Wilson, who is a translator of Homer's The Odyssey, which has been an amazing, completely plain-spoken, beautiful, very modern and elegant translation. And she will be coming to read from her new, as yet unfinished translation of the Iliad. And then in the spring, we have the poet and essayist Claudia Rankin, who will come and speak with us. And that is something that actually was supposed to happen in March live, but that's something that COVID canceled. So one of the reasons why I wanted to start with Frank this evening, with Frank Snowden, is because we are all here because of COVID. So this is the reason why we are doing this talk in this format, is because we can't meet together. And Frank Snowden is, in addition to his other many virtues, a scholar in the history of medicine. And I know it's a little flippant to say that anything good can possibly have come out of the pandemic, since I know so many people have suffered. But one thing that may be a tiny silver lining is that towards the end of 2019, Frank published a book called Epidemics and Society. And the onset of the pandemic made this into a very unlikely bestseller, which it's an amazing, beautiful, and very wide-ranging book about the effect of pandemics in history and epidemics in history. And so that's what we're going to be hearing about this evening. Frank is the Andrew Downey Orrick Professor Emeritus of History and the History of Medicine at Yale University, and his specializations on his website, on the faculty website, say that his specializations are Italian history, fascism, social history, and the history of medicine. And I have a feeling that we're going to get to all of those topics in this talk tonight. So I'm looking forward to it very much. Before we get into it, there's a little bit of business, which is that Frank will give his talk, which will be about half an hour, and then there'll be time for questions. So I think the way the questions should work, I've never actually moderated anything before. I've avoided that responsibility. So this is my very first one. So I'm going to try this out. If you have a question for Frank, just write in the chat, question. You don't have to say what it is, because in the question and answer, I will just call on you, and we will go in the order in which they are written in the chat section, and then we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. And the last little bit of business is please make sure that your microphone is muted. And now, without further ado, here is Frank Snowden. Frank.
Thank you very much for your generous introduction, David. And thank you all for being here this evening. And I'm delighted to have the invitation to talk to you. So I'll start right now. But what I wanted to do in the beginning is to be sure that I don't discombobulate and disappoint everyone right at the start, because I decided to have a variation on what I had originally intended to talk about. As you know from the publicity, the original idea was that I was going to talk about the terrible failure of nursing homes in our country. And that's a very important topic, and one that is very interesting. And if anyone wants to talk about it in the Q&A, we can certainly do that. But I've thought, as I was working in the last couple of weeks, that there was a different aspect of COVID-19 that was both more general and interesting. And I thought it might be more fun to share with you, because I'm working on it right at the moment. And also, it has a pertinent personal aspect that is directly relevant. So my subject this evening, I call Reflections on My Time at the Epicenter of COVID-19 in Lombardy, Italy, February to May 2020. That is the period when Italy was the second major country to be afflicted with COVID-19 and was at the center of world attention as the worst, sort of the worst case scenario, it was thought. Now, my experience has been of 40 years of research divided between two fields of history, as David was saying. One is modern Italy, and the other is the impact of epidemic diseases on societies. So this is a story in personal terms of a variety of ironies. The first was that my book, Epidemics in Society, that David referred to, was published in October 2019, and hardly had it appeared, then COVID-19, the first cases appeared in China in December of 2019. A further irony was that I had, by that point, I thought, having finished my work then on diseases, I was going to go back to Italian history and do something on the Cold War. So I left Italy in January with the idea that I'd be working in the newly opened Vatican archives, the papers of Pope Pius XII, who was one of the major architects of Western Cold War policy. But I arrived in Italy just as the coronavirus was beginning to circulate silently, and in late February, Italy became the epicenter, overtaking China and becoming the world's second country to experience a major epidemic of the coronavirus. So I ended up living through the collision of my two research interests. And to establish my street credibility, shall we say, I also contracted the disease, fortunately a mild case, and so I made my own personal but modest contribution to the Italian statistical profile of the epidemic. Well, the result for me was that, like everyone else in the world, and I'm sure you as well, my plans were thoroughly upended. The Vatican archives closed. The Cold War book I put away as a thought even, and instead I devoted myself entirely to COVID-19 with interviews, talks, reading, and direct observation from my lockdown and then quarantine in a neighborhood of Rome. Now, the onset of the Italian tragedy began with the first official case on February the 21st, 2020, in a small town in Lombardy. The tragedy erupted after a major super spreader event. And that event, I think we could talk about as uh, a football match. I know everyone will be fascinated by that. But on February 19th in Milan, there was a Champions League soccer game which featured a Spanish team, Valencia, versus an Italian team, Atalanta it was called, which represents the small Lombard city of Bergamo, a city of 120,000 people, 30 miles to the northeast of Milan. And the match was held at the San Siro Stadium, the famous, the largest stadium in Italy that holds 80,000 people. Now, in epidemiological terms, the virus, we should stress, was already circulating. It seems they've done now sewage samples and have discovered that already in December, they're able to recover DNA samples. So it was clearly circulating. And here we have a disease transmitted through the air by droplets and aerosols. And what we have, 40,000 people came from Bergamo to Milan on crowded trains and buses. There was a vast crowd milling outside the stadium. Inside, people packed shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same airspace, chanting, exchanging high fives. And the victory, you'll want to know this, Bergamo won 4-1, and that actually was perhaps good for Italian soccer, but it was bad for public health because it meant that after the match, there were late celebrations into the night in Milan, in the bars and restaurants, and then on crowded trains going back to Bergamo. A week later, and that's not by chance, that's the incubation period of COVID-19, the smoldering embers of the disease that were circulating silently erupted into a full-scale conflagration. Above all, in Bergamo and Milan, and then across Lombardy, and to a less extent, the neighboring region of Veneto. Those are all in the north of Italy, and I want to talk about that, how, why, what can we learn from that confluence of circumstances. Now, Lombardy is the center of the Italian tragedy of the spring. Nearly half of all Italian cases were there. That is to say, there were 17,000 people who died in Lombardy of 35,000 people who died in those months between February and May. And this was odd. First of all, Lombardy was reassuringly distant from Wuhan. It was 5,000 miles away and amounted to a 12-and-a-half-hour flight by a direct plane. And there was also a paradox of prosperity. That is to say, what one might have expected was that an Italian epidemic of this sort would primarily ravage the south and the great islands of Sicily and Sardinia on account of what's called the great sectional interest in Italian history, known as the Southern Question, which is to say that the South and the islands are relatively disadvantaged in a major way economically. They have much higher rates of unemployment. lower income, greater poverty, lower educational attainment, a fragile healthcare system, and a long history of being disproportionately affected by infectious diseases. Cholera, malaria, typhoid, and many others were primarily afflictions of the South. So COVID-19, by contrast, was an epidemic that ravaged the North instead. So I want to deal with that paradox. And here I think there are three major factors that ensured that in 2020, when Wuhan experienced an epidemic of a pulmonary virus transmitted through the air, that Milan, Bergamo, and all of Lombardy were at risk. And those three factors were globalization, demography, and environmental degradation. First of all, I'll deal with globalization, and I'd like to define COVID-19 as the first major pandemic of the era of globalization. In that sense, it's not, although it's frequently compared with the Spanish influenza of 1918 to 19, but that was transmitted primarily due to total war, and it occurred before even the first transatlantic air flight. So COVID-19, I would argue, is a product of an entirely different era. Now, pandemics aren't random events. They move through societies along pathways that human beings have created for them. In the case of COVID-19, globalization had given rise to broad and ever more crowded direct highways from China to Milan. Lombardy was not threatened despite its prosperity, but rather because of it. Now, there was a relationship, a very close relationship between China and Lombardy, Lombardy being the economic, financial, wealthiest fashion capital of Italy, and it fit into major economic planning by both China and Italy. And in 2017 at Beijing, President Xi Jinping of China met President Sergio Mattarella of Italy, and they signed a bilateral economic agreement. On the Chinese side, this involved the immense, its so-called Road and Belt Plan, which was global in scope, and the idea was to break down Chinese isolation. But Lombardy and Italy as a whole were an important component of the Chinese way of seeing the economic world. What the Chinese wanted was access to Milanese research and development, to managing and market skills, to technology in fields like aerospace, robotics, and artificial intelligence. On the Italian side, instead, the Italians had something very clear in mind. They wanted privileged access to China's burgeoning consumer market. Well, the implementation of the agreement was immediate, and there was set up a China-Italy Foundation, which led to hundreds of agreements between one company and the next, a Chinese one and its partner in Italy, to relationships between the political parties, between universities and research institutes. There was educational exchange, massive investment, mass tourism. 3.6 million tourists from China visited Milan in 2018, and the goal was to have 6 million in 2020. Didn't quite work out that way, because 2020 was proclaimed the Italy-China Year of Culture and Tourism. 6 airlines had daily flights direct between Milan on the one hand and Beijing, Nanjing, and Shanghai on the other. There was a rail freight link once a week with 40 flatbeds bearing goods and mechanical equipment from one country to the other. there were 25,000 Chinese residents who lived in Milan. So what I'm trying to say, there's a great meshing of the two societies, which is, I think, what we mean by globalization. At the same time, the second factor was one of demography. There's, of course, the absolute size of the population. You need a discrete minimum, but we're going well beyond that as we near 8 billion in the world and 60 million Italians. And that led to great density of population, and that's tremendously important for a pulmonary disease transmitted through the air. Lombardy as a whole, and this is significant, had the highest population density of Italy's 20 regions, with 420 inhabitants per square kilometer. Milan itself, it's the regional capital, was densely inhabited, with 7,500 residents per square kilometer, as opposed, say, to Amsterdam with 5,000, Madrid 5.5, Dublin 4,800, Berlin just under 4,000. That wasn't the absolute size, the density of the population, or epidemiologically critical, but so too was the age composition of the population. And here we see another paradox. The Italian life expectancy in 2020 was 83.3 years. And that made Italy the second in the world, second only to Japan in terms of life expectancy. And that was a triumph for the Italian medical system and its policy of access for everyone. That also, though, had an undertow, which was the graying of the Italian population. Italy had disproportionate numbers of frail and vulnerable people with an accumulation of pre-existing conditions such as diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. And Lombardy was the center of Italy's nursing homes. I promised you those. And there were 20% of Italy's care home population lived in Lombardy. Then the third major factor I wanted to call attention to was environmental degradation due to industrialization. So once again, we see it was Lombardy's industrial advanced nature, not its backwardness, that made the region vulnerable to a disease like COVID-19. The industrialization had to do with, first of all, fine particulate matter, which that is to say FM 2.5, that is those particles that are less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter, which is about, I think, a third of the diameter of a human hair. And what those particles can do is to reach the very depths, the alveoli of the respiratory system, where they cause inflammation of the lung, and the particles can also invade the blood system, the capillary system, and be transported throughout the body. And it's been discovered that fine particulate matter is a very important risk factor in COVID-19, and a lot of cartography, we could talk about that, of mapping the disease on top of the rest of particulate matter distribution in various countries shows a very, very strong correlation. And indeed, the World Health Organization warns us that particulate matter is a major cause of mortality worldwide, killing prematurely 9 million people a year, which is to say that it has a higher mortality on its own than accidents, tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS, malaria, all combined, that's the extent to which particulate matter is a major feature in mortality. And then there are toxic gases, ozone at ground level, nitrogen dioxide, and both of those together, they promote asthma, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and now COVID-19. There are sources being industry, road traffic, refineries, domestic heating, and something new has been recently discovered, which is the role of asphalt in roads, driveways, and roofs. And the land use pattern tends to be of 40% of the surface of a major city being covered in asphalt, which gives off more toxic material than the whole of vehicular traffic in the city. And one of the features that was discovered is that Lombardy, as the European Commission studied air quality in 66 administrative regions in Europe, and discovered that 5 of them were in the Po Valley, where Lombardy is located, because the Po Valley is surrounded by mountains, the Alps on the north and on the west, and to the south, the Apennines, and that shields, it forms a bowl-like effect, stretching for 650 kilometers, in which prevailing wind patterns don't dissipate the gases and the particulate matter. So Lombardy has one of the worst pollution records in the whole of Europe. And if you look at satellite pictures for large parts of the year of the Po Valley in which it sits, there's this evil black cloud of smog that hovers for an immense distance of 600 kilometers where Milan is. And one of the results then of that is that it gets even worse, because in times of downdraft, which bring this material down to land, to contact with human beings, and January and February 2020 were a period of a prolonged downdraft and one of the worst periods of prolonged terrible quality air in the history of Lombardy, just when a disease was to break out. That is an inflammation, a pulmonary inflammation of the lungs. One could also mention tobacco smoke, especially in the older generation of Italians, which was very important. So because I don't have a lot of time, I'll then say very quickly that the disaster emerged in late February, early March in the towns of Lombardy. Worst was the town of Bergamo, of soccer fame, which experienced 8,000 deaths in this period, with hotspots being the hospital, where the medical personnel contracted the disease at the rate of about 25%. And 50% of the deaths were people, the elderly, over the age of 65. Indeed, I wanted to read, just for 1 minute, a moving account from an anthropologist from Bergamo, Luisa Cortesi, who wrote about the atmosphere and the reality of her native city. She said, "What will Italy become without its elders? A generation of wisdom keepers, World War II survivors, storytellers, parents, and grandparents. Our elders are dying one by one. Coffins, too many to bury, are lined up in churches, in convoys, in the streets. There lie our elders, waiting to be turned to ashes. The crematorium fire never ceases, smoldering 24 hours a day. It crackles, it consumes bones, lace collars, mustaches, and memories. Within the coffins is the wisdom of the place I come from. Draped in a shroud, saturated with disinfectant. What will become of us without our elders? So this was known as, in the Italian press, the massacre of Bergamo, and sometimes the massacre of Lombardy. But I don't want to leave with that gloomy moment. I want to say that on the 10th of March, the Italian Prime Minister began an enormous program to deal with the emergency. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte issued a decree that imposed a lockdown on the whole of the Italian peninsula, and the terms were enormously severe. And I lived through with these rules myself. You were allowed to go out of your home only for two reasons. One was to go to a pharmacy, and the other was to go to a grocery shop. And when you went, you had to have a printed form that stated your destination and the purpose of your trip, so that there were police everywhere in the streets. And if they stopped you and you were at a place that didn't coincide with what you had written on your destination before you left home, you were subject to a major fine. Now, the Conte practiced enormously important messaging because there was just one voice. It was informed by science. All the political parties of Italy joined in support and said, there is no alternative to this. This is the only way that we can save our country, our families, ourselves, and that this is what will happen. And we had a lockdown then for a month and a half and a bit more. And what was amazing about it was the compliance, because unlike the United States, which I think one could describe as perhaps not such a great symphony orchestra playing without a conductor and leading to a cacophony of sound, in Italy, you had a single conductor and one message. There were placards everywhere on the newspapers, on the radio and television. The street walls had the regulations. Vans went out through the towns with loudspeakers telling people they had to stay indoors. And a sort of miracle happened. The Messaggero newspaper, the Rome local daily, said that this was a miracle. This was the first time in 3,000 years of Italian history that the Roman people had ever obeyed anything. And it was also true that I could see this and experienced it. If you lined up outside the grocery store, people were talking about that this was like perhaps what London was like during the Blitz. And we don't like these restrictions. So there was a compliance, and this enabled the Italians to flatten the curve, as they say. And I think it's part of a partial success story, which is now allowing Italians to begin in a phased way to open their economy. So I didn't want to end on a gloomy note, but I am aware that I've just run out of time. So I will stop there and we can talk about anything that you would like. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for that lecture. I really enjoyed that, and I particularly resonated with the idea of comparing the way a society works to the way an orchestra works.
Oh, good.
Because you know, an orchestra, music only works in an orchestra if everyone agrees that they have a role to play and they're going to cooperate. And when you don't have a society that works with that kind of faith in your relationship to each other, you can't really have a society. And so so I think people in my field in classical music are used to the idea of talking about how the orchestra was formed with some sort of a social model back in the 18th century. And I also, the other thing that makes me I want to think about is the relationship between between the fact that this is a globalization problem, so that this is a very wealthy society. It seems like in our society, we have so many other problems that that sort of maybe the wealth allows for it to come, but then we have this extra layer of class, which kind of separates who is affected here and who can be treated and how people are treated and how people can protect themselves or can't protect themselves. So maybe there's like, it's the difference between the average economic level and the, you know, on the outside, and the intense inequality which comes in the middle. So
yes, I would agree with that formulation, in fact, yes.
do we have some questions? I don't see anyone in our chat room. So if someone has a question, please go right ahead. So
I think I see a hand.
Oh, is it okay if I just ask, David?
that's great.
Okay. You mentioned about the celebrations after the football match, and how that could have potentially advanced the spread. Could you maybe elaborate on that and any other maybe traditional Italian customs or lifestyles that also could have led to such a sharp surge?
Right. It had all of the sorts of dimensions to it that would have terribly frightened Anthony Fauci, which is to say, people crowded together. They didn't know the disease was circulating silently. There was no social distancing, no masking. And then people went after hours. Well, it even began when they left Bergamo. They arrive in Milan, they mill outside, that takes a long time. People from other places are gathered with them, and then they go into the stadium, they're crammed together, and when you project your voice, shouting and singing supporter songs, the virus is carried much further, and everyone in the stadium you're in an enclosed, semi-enclosed space, and the air is shared. And then after the football match, it's a victory and people go out to celebrate. And they do exactly what Fauci says we mustn't do, which was to go into bars. And there people in bars stand very close together, and once again, they're singing, and you're twice as likely to transmit a disease or have it 20 times as likely to be transmitted to you if you're in an enclosed space like a bar or a restaurant as you would outdoors. And once again, no one is masked. And these were very crowded spaces. And the neighborhood around the stadium also was very much, had an upsurge immediately a week later, which isn't by coincidence. So in epidemiological terms, this is what's notable about COVID-19 is that it doesn't spread. There are mathematical models of it where people wish to reduce its transmission rate, the number of people that one person on average can transmit the disease to. The trouble with that mathematical model is that it misleads epidemiologists into what they should be looking for in trying to block transmission, because COVID-19 doesn't spread equably through a community. Instead, it spreads in clusters and by means of great super spreader events. And we know, for example, that in East Lansing, Michigan, there was a single bar that affected 900 people. We know that choir practices have been known to infect an entire choir of 80 or 90 people, all of those people singing in an enclosed space like that, as they're all projecting, just like the football fans. So there are really good epidemiological reasons why a disease spread in clusters that through the air, through droplets and aerosols, would thrive if you bring 80,000 people together yelling and screaming for hours, and then afterwards they disgorge into the local bars and indoor restaurants. So that was a major, in fact, the mayor of Bergamo said this was ground zero for the coronavirus infection, this particular football match.
We have a question from Jeffrey Laurenti.
Thank you, David. And thank you very much, Frank, for a fascinating presentation. In fact, I arrived in Rome the morning of March 10th, leaving the US thinking I was going to be on a vacation and finding a city under complete lockdown. Although San Pietro was amazing to see, empty of any human life at all, although one couldn't go into it. In any event, I wanted to ask actually a couple questions if I can. First, the penetration into small towns. Because Bergamo is itself at least a provincial capital. It's that much of a city. And supposedly one of the early hotspots was it Codogno?
Codogno, yes. That was where
Codogno, right.
Patient one was there.
Ah, right. To what extent did small town Italy in the center, the south, Tuscany, Umbria, onto the south, experience anything except the rigors of a lockdown? Did it experience any penetration of the virus? One thinks that of Sardinia that was totally untouched until the guy at the Costa Smeralda and his parties in the summer. And allow me then to ask, are you back into the Vatican archives now? And whom was Pacelli, Pope Pius XII, directing in the period you're looking to study? Was it just the Italian Christian democracy, De Gasperi, and then? Or was he also steering the big powers, the US somehow, and the other Western powers in the shaping of the Cold War confrontation?
Right. I guess I should take those in reverse order, and then that'll bring us back to COVID-19. But since you did ask about Pius XII, I would say that the record is really very clear. I've been working on the archives of the Christian Democrats and the archives of the police and in the American archives for some years now. And it's abundantly clear that the Pope is one of the prime architects of the Cold War conflict, and that he was involved very much, of course, in the Christian Democratic Party, but there's much more to the story than that. And the Pope was engaged, and Truman had the vision as well that there could be an alliance of faiths to combat atheistic communism. And so the Pope was also involved indirectly through American bishops in mobilizing veterans and Catholics to confront subversion throughout this country. And then also there was in purging and sort of introducing McCarthyism to Italy in the form of purging workforces, tracking families, finding out what people read, and replacing people with others who were selected by bishops. And most sad of all was the involvement of the Pope with the Gladio scandal. I don't know if everyone knows Gladio. Gladio was, and it's interesting in America, this doesn't get a lot of coverage, but Gladio was a stay-behind army that set up throughout Western Europe. So it was in Scandinavia. One can read about it in Colby, the CIA directors. He writes about setting up this institution himself in Scandinavia, and it was set up in Britain, in Switzerland, in Italy, in Spain, in Turkey. And it consisted of, if you like, armed by NATO fighters who would, they would not only be behind the lines fighting the Russian army, they would also be involved in keeping a left-wing party. Communism is porous. It can mean the Socialist Party as well. And so it could be used for those purposes. And indeed, George Kennan, who's usually fairly rational in these matters, is on record writing that perhaps the election of 1948, in which the Pope intervened heavily, was too important for democracy to be left to the voters. And you have then in this period, the Pope recruiting neo-fascists to staff the Gladio organization. So I want to say that Pope, this is not something that continues under John the 23rd. That's very different. But under Pius XII, this was Vatican policy in the early years of the Cold War, in the late 40s and into the 50s. And so, yes, the Pope was very, very heavily involved. And I have the records of that, but usually from a second party, the Italian Policeman and American Observer. I would like to be able to have Pacelli's own words describing what he was doing. So there's that. Then I'm coming back to COVID-19, and it's the case that Italy, yes, this policy was fairly successful in preventing a general national spread of the disease. And there was immediately when the strict policy was announced, people got on trains to be with their families and escape the disease. And they did take the disease with them. But by and large, the lockdown was successful with some failures in preventing the disease from spreading in any major way in Sicily or Sardinia or Calabria. It reached Rome, it reached places in Tuscany. And so one can't say that it didn't spread, but overwhelmingly in this phase, now what we're going to see, I think now perhaps, it may be a broader spread. So this only applies to the period down through May of 2020, and not for what is happening now or during the summer, which is somewhat different. But through that period, this was overwhelmingly a disease that ravaged northern Italy, and much less. Everyone in Bergamo or Milan knew someone who died. In Rome, almost no one did. Was a major difference but in the whole atmosphere and the reality of those two cities, for example.
Do we have any other takers for questions? Robert?
Thank you, Frank, for a wonderful lecture. I really like the fact that you emphasized how uneven the infections happen, and that you need these kind of super spreading events and super spreaders. But so that means that the really critical moments, various elements have to come together. So there's undoubtedly also a strong element of chance here, just bad luck. And I'm kind of wondering, are we able to, in some sense, take that into consideration? Because it's easy to draw conclusions that certain countries, certain governments, certain societies have behaved better or worse, but they might just have really bad luck.
I think contingency is something that historians and epidemiologists both love. And I would be wrong to say that it doesn't play a role. Anyone can be in the wrong place at the wrong time. and that will always be true. And so there isn't a cast iron rule, but it does seem that there is a logic to some degree that the disease follows in the way that it is transmitted through a society. And I think it's very important that public health officials pay attention to the places, the junctures that are most critical in the spread of the disease. So masking is very important, of course, but I think preventing large congregations of people, particularly drinking when they don't take the precaution of staying far apart, and they talk because they're so loud. They're talking right in each other's faces. That's a much riskier place than walking outside and wearing a mask. So I think there's certain priorities that one can figure out once realizing that it is spreads in clusters, and it usually takes it's not like smallpox that spreads instantly and over a great distance. Usually it has to have some duration, the contact, in the course of an hour's conversation or a close contact like that, rather than sitting in a plane and someone 10 rows behind you, as might happen with measles, let us say. So COVID has its own logic, and I think that there's a logic there, although it is chance to say whether you or I are the person in the pub at the time that someone comes in who has the disease. That's contingency, that it should be you or I. But it's also true that, like we know, the meatpacking factories have the same sort of rule in our country, and automobile plants or mines. And this is also the reason that my original topic of nursing homes, that those were super spreader events of the same kind, this explosive sort of wildfire way in which the disease moved through congregant living or prisons or homeless shelters in our country. Those are places where the disease has disproportionately affected people for reasons that epidemiologists, now that they know how the disease spreads in this way, not equably through a society, but at certain nodal points, junctures are critical.
Can I follow up question? Why it seemed that it took a long time for the community, the scientific community, advising to emphasize this kind of inequitable distribution of spreading events, right? So it's, and I guess some countries might have been lucky that they took the kind of action that is appropriate for that kind of distribution, while others did not. I think often Sweden is mentioned as a case that by forbidding any gatherings of more than 50 people, closing high schools and universities above 16, that these were the appropriate things to do in that context. But it seemed that it took some time for this insight to emerge out of the community advising governments.
I would say both yes and no. What's interesting is that there were places that had a prior experience with a coronavirus, and that is MERS, and South Korea, because of that experience, was very quick to take the kinds of coherent science-based measures. So the science was there, and people had access to it. But I think a big feature was that people thought there was a kind of hubris in the European community and the United States. This can't really affect a wealthy, prosperous country protected by science with a robust healthcare system, this is something we know that this won't really happen to us. I think that was a feature, and I think it's more that many governments did. It's true that some governments listened to their science advisors, the Netherlands and, as you say, Sweden. Other countries really did not, of which Brazil and the United States, I think, are the prime examples, and have paid the penalty for not believing in science. There's a whole issue here in this discussion, I think, of belief in science and trust in government as being very important factors in the way that this disease is spreading. And not taking coherent measures is, makes one an ally of the virus.
Well, on that optimistic note, let us all thank you. Frank Snowden, that was a really fantastic and really interesting lecture. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience, and best of luck to everyone.